share with people who are here in spirit. And yeah, after the presentations today, we'll also have a Q&A questions. So please make use of the chat. We have that available. So my name is Marissa Gutierrez-Vicario. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-chair of the Steering Committee of Human Rights Educators USA. So for folks that don't know, HRE USA promotes human dignity, justice, and peace by cultivating an expansive, vibrant base of support for human rights education within the United States. So I'm really excited and very honored to be here with you all today, because this is our organization's very first Human Rights Educators Impact Award. And so this is huge, this is new and exciting, and hopefully part of a long legacy of other human rights folks. So we're actually going to be honoring today nearly 50 years of extraordinary contributions of the International Indian Treaty Council to, and their contributions, their work, and their passion for human rights education in the United States and also around the world. So yeah, I don't know if we can just give a quick, like, if you want to like wave your hands or just in celebration, because it really is special. And as part of the celebration, I'd like to introduce Mariana Ferreira and Christy Rudelius Palmer. So they're the IITC nominators, and they're going to speak a little bit more about this award and just about the incredible recipients and also the context in which they work today. So thank you and welcome, and what a pleasure to have you all in this space with us. I'll pass it over.
Thank you very much. Am I supposed to go first? Okay, so my name is Mariana Leal Ferreira. I'm a Brazilian medical anthropologist, and I worked in central Brazil and in the Amazon north and in the southern Brazil for many years as a teacher and elementary school teacher on indigenous schools with several indigenous peoples there, and then came to the United States and worked with the Yurok people. So to me, it's a great pleasure to be here and to nominate the International Indian Treaty Council for this award. And the reason why I'm doing this is because the International Indian Treaty Council has been really important to my work and securing some of the rights of indigenous peoples in Brazil, also in North America. But in Brazil, mostly the Xavante in central Brazil, the Caiabi, which is the largest indigenous population in South America with about 50,000 people right now, small compared to the United States, but still. And so I followed the International Indian Treaty Council all the way down from little Brazil, you know, in the Amazon. We didn't even have cell phones or anything, but I knew of their work. But in the year 2002, I was working as a coordinator of Xavante indigenous projects for environmental justice, for education equity, and in light of all this work we were doing, and for the first time we were using GPS instruments, and one of the elders, an indigenous Xavante with an X, leader and political and religious leader was assassinated. And we know exactly how it happened, who was the killer, the son of the soybean king of the area, because soybean is really big there, and China actually buys all the soybeans from Brazil. So anyway, we knew exactly what had happened and we reported it. And then we, including myself, started receiving all kinds of retaliation, threats, my kids at home, who were living here in California, by the way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I contacted the IITC, and guess what? They helped us. They contacted the UN and the Special Rapporteur for Judicial Killings, and they interceded in our favor. And the Brazilian government, who at that time was in the hands of democratic people, not like Bolsonaro now, sort of protected the Xavante people and us. I mean, they opened a court case and they did all that. So thanks to IITC, there was some kind of international movement that protected the rights of indigenous peoples and little known Central Brazil, which nobody knows even what's going on there. But the ITTC did know what was going on there, and they took care of them and all of us. So for that, I commend that. That's one of the reasons. The second reason is that because of Andrea Carmen, I grew up in a museum sort of setting in Brazil because my mom was a museologist, and then I came to San Francisco State where I teach, and you know, there were museums there, and we still have human remains there. And so I became part of those committees, and I started to find out what was happening there at San Francisco State. Nobody had any idea of, and they have like sacred objects and remains and all this stuff. So I became really involved in that. And because of that, then many things happened. But I just recently read in the New York Times, maybe a month ago, Andrea Carmen, that after 11 years or so of you petitioning to have the remains of your nation, not remains, but like sacred objects and all kinds of sacred things repatriated to the United States, you won that battle. And so I commend you and the IITC for that. I'm very, 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 it's not proud as not, but I'm so glad that this happened because I've been following this, and it spurred a lot of movements from other organizations. For example, Berlin, okay, that was before. Berlin returns artifacts to Indigenous peoples of Alaska. So that happened before the Yaqui, and I don't even know if you have received your sacred, I don't want to say objects, your sacred items yet, but your dedication to this, Andrea, really helped other Indigenous peoples do the same. I just read about Nigeria, for example. Nigeria, they have this whole thing going on about this museum, and then England has to return, and they cited you. So this is another reason why I have nominated IITC for this Impact Award for human rights and human rights education, because I was educated by you guys too. So thank you very much for everything you have done, IITC.
Thank you, Mariana. That was wonderful. It is my great honor to have also been a nominator with Mariana of the IITC for the first HRE USA Impact Award. 3 IITC board members, Bill Means and Pat and Lisa Bellinger, have significantly impacted my work as a human rights educator. I worked with Pat and Bill to launch the first human rights education program in Minnesota back in 1992. The Partners in Human Rights Education, which was a joint initiative of the Advocates for Human Rights and the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center. They also were instrumental in establishing the mock trial of Christopher Columbus, held in the same year, 30 years ago, at the Minnesota State Capitol, and he was found guilty. They patiently worked to infuse their Indigenous peoples' human rights teachings and advocacy learnings as board members of IITC into our local Minnesota HRE programmatic philosophies, training, and curricula. In 2003 to 2007, Lisa Bellinger worked to help develop and facilitate training on the statewide This Is My Home, a Minnesota human rights education experience, and its K-12 toolkit and curriculum. She infused her experiences and as an Indigenous human rights educator into the development of this resource. In 2014, she facilitated a teaching institute in Minnesota for Vermont educators to learn about the US Dakota conflict and the American Indian movement through an HRE framework. That same year, IITC board member Bill Means, along with other Indigenous leaders, coordinated the tribunal to free Leonard Peltier. And in the subsequent year, held an International Truth Commission. I just lost my place. International Truth and Reconciliation process on the U.S. boarding schools. Both sessions were held at the Oneida Nation with support of the IITC. These are only a few examples of the community engaged human rights education work supported by the IITC, conducted over its past 50 years. On a personal level, I have learned so much from these leaders and have been honored to have collaborated on numerous local and national initiatives, Indigenous human rights handbooks and curricula, workshops and conferences. We have developed joint youth and Indigenous human rights summits in collaboration with the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center and Amnesty International. And for 3 years, the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center was able to host the North American preparatory session for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And in that capacity, I was able to work firsthand with Andrea Carmen, the IITC Executive Director. She is an incredible leader that we're so thrilled to have be able to speak with us here today. And she definitely is a mover and shaker. My heartfelt gratitude for IITC's leadership teachings that goes far beyond words. So congratulations on receiving HRE USA's first ever Impact Award for your nearly 50 years of service as an institution. So again, like Marissa said, let's have some handshakes. Congratulations. And I would just like to also, before we turn the floor over to have Andrea kick us off to say some words on a little bit on IITC, but more on her focus in IIT's work on climate change. But I want to recognize Nancy Flowers, who chaired the committee. So thank you, Nancy, for just your leadership in this work. And then we will have Kaylee Bradford and Alana Haviv and Christina Eberbach have also played a really important part on the Training as Action series and will help facilitate some of our discussion later. So I think, why don't I just hand it off to you, Andrea, at this point. So thank you so much for being here. And then after you're done speaking, we'll have a Q&A session. Oh, wait. Hold on, we may have someone joining us who was supposed to be the initial speaker and was having some technological difficulties. So we'll see if he's able to join us. This is Bill Means, who I've been mentioning already in my introductory remarks, who was one of the founders of IITC back in 1974. And has also, I think, Andrea, did he have also lead as kind of the president or executive director for 9 years in there?
He was the president of our board of directors, and he was the one who convinced me to become executive director back in 1992, 6-month interim. So that was 30 years ago this year. So yes, we've been working together a very long time. Well, first of all, thank you very much. And that was a little bit embarrassing, the wonderful words you all had to say, not about IITC, because obviously I wouldn't have been part of IITC almost all of my adult life if I didn't believe all the things you're saying and more, but about me. It's hard to hear those things, but it is true. And it's been 19 years, actually, it was 19 years that we addressed the Swedish government to return our sacred Masakova, our ceremonial deer's head, from their national museum in Stockholm, and they would have never given it back. They told us they weren't going to give it back if it wasn't for the engagement of the United Nations human rights arena that we had learned very well how to utilize, and as was mentioned in the process began an a movement for international repatriation of Indigenous peoples' sacred items and human remains that has spread globally. And now, because of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognizes our right to repatriation of our sacred objects and human remains, we've been able to support and facilitate the return and the struggle for return that's still in process of many, many Indigenous peoples. The view is changing because our rights are recognized. So I'm going to be talking in particular about climate justice and the rights of Indigenous peoples, because if there is one struggle that we all need to be part of, it's a struggle that really is a struggle for life and death and survival of our peoples, not just our way of life, but our actual peoples as Indigenous peoples, and really all members of the human family and all beings in the natural world. And that's climate change, or the climate crisis going on right now. So this picture says a lot of things, including the way that the International Indian Treaty Council does our work. And there's a reason why the elders that founded the International Indian Treaty Council back in 1974 gave us the sacred pipe for our logo. I see Bill's kind of coming into frame there. And he would probably be the one to talk about this. If you can connect, Bill, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and say that this is a picture of a traditional corn altar of the Navajo or Dene peoples at a conference that we had. We've had 5 international conferences of Indigenous corn peoples to talk about our ecosystems and our way of life, our food sovereignty. But at the basis of it is that spiritual and cultural connection that we have to all of the aspects of our Mother Earth that sustain us and give us life. And you can see the 4 sacred colors of corn, the white, the yellow, the black, and the red are also the 4 sacred colors of the 4 directions of the sun dance. They're the 4 colors of corn used all the way to South America. And they show the practical application of that spiritual understanding, because these varieties of corn are also what give us the ability to adapt to climate change. Our peoples, and we just had a conference that Bill and I were both at in person in Rapid City on Chetesacoan climate crisis conference to make a survival plan. And it was discussed there about that kind of connection with our traditional food that's going to be the basis of our survival. But this is also a picture of our rights, because without our right to land, to water, to the integrity of our traditional corn that can be used, whatever climate is coming, our peoples have the knowledge to know if it was going to be a hot year or a dry year or a wet year or a cold year, the next year in advance. A very, very developed science based on many forms and ways of knowing. And so they knew what color of corn to plant. So unless we have all of these rights that are realized, it's going to be very difficult for us to survive in what's coming. Here's one of the things you wanted us to talk about, and that's the founding of the International Indian Treaty Council that came as a result of...
Hello?
Bill, you're there.
Testing. Hello?
Go ahead. This slide
This is Bill.
take right
How are
on.
you, ladies and gentlemen? I can't hear you.
You can't hear us?
Ask him if his speaker is on.
Can I hear you?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
I wonder if, when you start coming on and they ask you before if you want your audio on, because he's got all this stuff.
Tell me if you want me to continue or wait to see if he can come on.
I think you can continue. I'll try and reach out to him on phone.
Okay, maybe his speaker might be off. That actually happened to me in an earlier Zoom call today, so give that a try. So the IITC was formed and founded in June 1974 on Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota after a period of a lot of turmoil and the assertion of rights of Indigenous peoples in the United States, but also throughout the continent. And this is the Declaration of Continuing Independence that was agreed by consensus of over 5,000 participants in this gathering in Standing Rock. And it says that treaties between sovereign nations explicitly entail agreements which represent the supreme law of the land. Of course, that's a quote from the US Constitution, binding each party to an inviolate international relationship. And that's the approach we continue to take at the United Nations. And I will just mention that there were 6 founding purposes of the International Indian Treaty Council that were agreed to that week. And one of
Hello?
them, hi, Bill,
Yeah.
can you hear?
No, once in a while I can see you.
Oh, we can't see you and we can hear you though.
I saw you and
Okay, I'll just finish my thought as he tries to come on here that one of the founding purposes, the 6 original founding purposes was to
can't
provide
even find the volume.
Education
Record,
about
show,
Indigenous
captions,
peoples.
reactions,
Okay, I'll wait till we decide what to do here. Have one of our founding guiding principles, which is that Indigenous people should speak for and represent themselves before the world community. And of course, IITC was the first Indigenous organization to be recognized with what's called consultative status at the UN Economic and Social Council. And we're the only one in the world so far that's been upgraded by ECOSOC to what's called general consultative status because of the vast number of bodies and issues we work on at the United Nations on behalf of Indigenous peoples and their rights. These are 2 of our young representatives who I think were the only actual youth that spoke at a UN expert mechanism on rights of Indigenous peoples intervention and focus on access to justice for Indigenous youth, which kind of struck us as strange because we're talking about Indigenous youth here, and they're the ones we feel should be talking about what is justice for them. So in that light, I want to focus on climate change because, as I said to begin with, it's one of the, if not the single greatest threats to our survival and our way of life, not just ours, but yours as well. But it's been Indigenous peoples that have been at the forefront of a call to address this issue for decades now, because our prophecies talk about what's going to happen in this time if the human family continues to disregard their caretaker role for Mother Earth. And I am firmly convinced that they would not have left us the warning if they didn't also leave us the solutions. But right now at the United Nations, the estimate is a million species currently face extinction, including the one pictured here, which is the spring run Chinook salmon in Central California, which are threatened by just small rises in the temperature of the Delta area and the ocean. Salmon are what's called an indicator species, and they're not predicted to survive by the scientists, even in the most positive scenario past the end of this century. And these are essential for not just the nutrition of California Indian people, but also their cultural practices, their ceremonial practices. This is another, the amphibians and salamanders, toads, frogs are another indicator species because they breathe through their skin and they're very susceptible. And this is Sonora desert toad in my own backyard. They come out after the monsoon rains in late July, and they eat the insects that threaten our crops. And we're a desert farming peoples, the Yaqui Indian Nation. We're in southern Arizona, United States, and northern Mexico, Sonora, Mexico. But just a couple years ago, the rains didn't come at the right time. They came in June, and the toads came out. They thought it was time for them to come out, but it got hot and dry again, and they all dried up and died. And so since that time, they've never really replenished themselves. And so we have a lot of bugs eating our crops when it's time for harvest in August, because of this delicate balance in the desert and our ecosystems. And this is just another example. Of course, you know, the tornadoes through the Midwest, the hurricanes in the islands. This is Hurricane, or otherwise known as Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria. And just think for a moment, because you're right there. The central part of the United States is the only landmass in the entire world that has an unbroken connection between an Arctic landmass and a tropical ocean, the Caribbean, with no mountain ranges in between. And all those climate deniers in the middle part of the country, you know, are going to learn and are learning about climate change the hard way. The fires, of course, in California, British Columbia are another example. In 2020, it was the hottest, driest year ever recorded in the Sonora Desert in Tucson, Arizona, where it's always hot and dry. And this is a natural plant that we use for food and medicine. It's very good for curing diabetes, and it was withering. You can see, usually these are big, fat, plump cactuses. It was even the natural plant that's indigenous to the desert was wilting. It was so hot and dry. And just to recall, when we're talking about our food systems and the impact of climate change, many of our reservations are already known as food deserts. For example, the Tohono Nation, which is our neighbor right down the road, is the second largest landmass tribe in the United States. It's as large as several states put together, and they only have one grocery store on it, owned by non-Indigenous peoples. Same for Pine Ridge in South Dakota, 800,000 acres. Size of Rhode Island has only one grocery store, also owned by non-tribal members. So our food systems and the impact of climate change is especially extreme. This is back to what Bill was going to talk about too. But this is the 1977 first United Nations Conference on Discrimination of Indigenous People. See that young man right kind of in the middle towards the back a little bit? That's Bill. You know, participants in this very first time that Indigenous peoples marched into the UN. And one of the demands from this conference was to create a UN standard recognizing the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. I think Bill's on. I see him. Are you there? So fast forward 30 years, the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 30 years from 1977 to 2007. And this is the basis of the exercise of our rights in the international arena.
Bill is muted, though.
Bill, you're muted. You want to talk? You need to get off mute. The declaration is the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being.
Hello, good morning. How are you?
You're there. Okay, I'll stop right here then.
I hate to keep making you stop and start, but
That's okay. I can do anything. Okay, go ahead, please. I talked about a little bit about the founding of the International and Treaty Council because it was in my slideshow, but you should go ahead and talk about that part, our right-based approach to our work. based
Okay,
on.
and Andrea, if you want to just stop sharing your videos for just, or your slides for
Sure.
a second, then we'll interlude with with Phil's presentation. You can get off the phone, Bill. You don't need to be on the phone anymore. We've done it. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your patience and endurance to try and join us here. So we are so glad to have you with us. And we've already introduced you a bit, so I don't know if you just want to jump in to say your remarks, and then we'll finish off with Andrea's comments afterwards.
I hope how midak upi ampetu kile chante mawashte na pay chizak tilo. What I said was, hello, my relatives. Today is a good day. The hearts of our people are strong, and we extend our hand in friendship. That's a traditional greeting that we usually give when we're asked to speak in front of people. So again, it's good to see you all, and hopefully we'll meet here somehow on cyberspace. But Treaty Council was born out of a struggle at Wounded Knee in 1973, in which we, being the American Indian movement, we liberated a place called Wounded Knee, where over 300 men, women, and children are buried in a mass grave, and it's on our reservation, 8 miles from our home community known as Porcupine, South Dakota. Wounded Knee is a district also of the reservation in terms of a geographic area that represents many families. So, but there's a monument there. Like I said, in 1890, massacre happened. Well, we decided that it was time, we being the American Indian movement, that it was time to make a statement to the United States on behalf of Lakota people, but using the treaties, which brought about unity with the elderly people, chiefs, headsmen, which we still had those traditional leaders back there in 1973. And so they all came to Wounded Knee for various meetings throughout the 71 days we were there. The newspapers, everyone else called it an occupation, of course. We called it a liberation because it was a community that was run by the people. It was a community that was surrounded by United States military and other federal jurisdictions of police. And so it was in that kind of a context that we were in confrontation for 71 days with the United States government. And we had this treaty with the United States signed in 1868. And a lot of people dismiss treaty rights because they don't teach this in the public schools of America. They try to edit us out of existence. So nobody really learned these type of things and issues except the elders kept this in their mind. And when they spoke, they always spoke as a treaty is the reason why we're here. Not to fight people on the reservation, but to keep in mind that United States government was our enemy and one of the greatest enemies of Indian people. And for not only Indians of this country, but indigenous people all over the world through colonization and other issues that we learned were common. But back to the Treaty Council. And so coming out of this 71-day conflict with the United States, we began to talk about what are we going to do from here. And so since we had our chiefs and headsmen with us in Wounded Knee, they asked us to put together a treaty conference in which Indian people could come together and decide what we should do, because we had the attention of the world basically at Wounded Knee in 1973. And we needed to educate not only Indigenous people, but non-Indian allies and other people that were supporting what we did there in Wounded Knee, and supported the issue of treaty rights, which later became a battle of ours into human rights. So we used the issue of human rights to enter into the United Nations work. And so, but before we did that, we had a conference on Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. And the Standing Rock is part of the Great Sioux Nation, of course, and they're in the north. Many of those people that settled there, they're known as Hunkpapa. And Hunkpapa people were the people of Sitting Bull, who was a famous chief. And he came from the north. But we had a big nation. If you realize the geographic area that we governed or that we controlled was somewhere, between Minnesota all the way to the Bighorn Mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and then south to the Platte River in Nebraska, all the way over to Missouri River, and then up and including some reservations are Indian communities in Minnesota and, of course, South Dakota, Nebraska. So we had a big area, and that's what our treaty, we said that's what our territory should be identified with is in the treaty. And so it set our geographic boundaries. And so we took that issue of treaties, and it was the elders, of course, chiefs and headsmen, the ladies. I remember at Wounded Knee, we had ladies on the negotiating committee with the United States government there for the 71 days. So they played a big role in the leadership of Wounded Knee before and after the establishment of American Indian movement and their part in the struggle. So it's very important to remember that these elders are the ones who had the knowledge of the treaties and kept them all these years and knew the power of treaties, because they said it, Article 6 of the United States Constitution itself, it talks about treaties being the law of the land. And treaties are as good today as they were signed back in the day of 1862 and 1868. And so these are legal documents. And we consequently, through trials of Wounded Knee and others, we proved that they were legal signed documents that were certified by the United States Senate. So they went through the diplomatic process and the recognition process of the United States government. They're valid under the law. And so we took this subject. When we got to the United Nations, we had these treaties, and the elder, I remember one, Fool's Crow, he said, you stick that treaty in the door when they try to close it on you. And that was pretty good symbolism there. And so that's the way our elders looked at it, as not tribe to tribe or university, we're nations of people. And we stand on that because we have a treaty, we have a legal document signed by the United States. So just give a standing, as they say in a court. So just to make it a little speed things up here, we had standing at the United Nations because we had treaties. And so we worked our way through the bureaucracy of the UN to become recognized officially. And then finally in 2007, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed and recognized by a good majority of nations at the UN. Of course, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada didn't sign it because they're the biggest colonial powers and biggest thieves of Indian and indigenous people's land in the world. They literally divided up the world in that colonial system. So these are the issues we began to bring is, we said these are human rights. We got involved into those types of interpretation by scholars who said that all human beings have certain inalienable rights they are born with. And so we began to take that type of philosophy, that type of legal standing, and compare it and work with the treaties as our example of our nationhood, and not just, like I say, tribes or communities or various other ways they divide us up and stole our land. So that's, we took those types of issues in the whole field of human rights. And we took a lot of, at least myself personally, I read about this lady who was a president's wife who had to literally talk her husband into signing the document known as the Declaration of Human Rights. And that was Eleanor Roosevelt. And so this type of history shows that the recognition of human rights was not an easy path to travel, because there's a basic right that people have, and that's what the world was trying to say. That would prevent a lot of wars, that would prevent a lot of conflict if we recognized people as human beings and not as subjects or ethnic minorities or populations. Various other terms they tried to develop to hide the fact that they were stealing and killing indigenous people all over the world. And first we had the right to life. It's got to be a human right. And so we began to promote those things throughout the world in various formal positions, in formal meetings within the UN itself, known as the Human Rights Commission at that time. That's what it was called. And so we began to attend those meetings in the headquarters of the human rights, which was Geneva, Switzerland, and present our treaties. And so that's the founding, and another part I'd like to say is not all Indian people supported us in the beginning. First of all, they didn't understand the issue of human rights and its relationship to treaties and how we could use our treaties to prove who we were as indigenous nations, not only us, but around the world. So it started out as we said we had a conference on the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And after we had that conference, we realized, of course, talking and meeting many delegations from all over the world at the UN, we met them and they said, well, we too are indigenous. We too have our culture and our language. We too have the basis of our way we governed ourselves, our government. We keep those things alive. And so we, as indigenous people, began to meet at the United Nations. And this is where we are now. We came all the way from Wounded Knee to the lake by Geneva, Switzerland, and the United Nations headquarters in New York City. So this has been a road well traveled, because many people have been there, not only indigenous people, but people who love peace, people who don't want to experience war in their own home communities or anywhere else. And these are the people that stand for the basic interests for humanity, is human rights. And we have a right to our little portion of the world as indigenous people. We came from the stars, the Lakota. And there's many tribes and people that say this is how they're created, or they have their own creation story, just like Americans, Christians, Irishmen, all those people of the world. They have an idea as to where they came from. And we know that. We didn't come across the Bering Straits. Matter of fact, there were tracks on the Bering Straits, they were going the other way. This has actually been written about by a man called Jeffrey Goodman, who wrote about the beginnings of civilization being on this side of the world. And there are various theories and evidence that he's written about that gives some truth, tells the story of indigenous people. So this is the type of way that we called on the United Nations in a challenge to recognize indigenous people. And finally in 2007, we were recognized with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is just how we were formed. And it was over a period like this will be, we formed in 74, and it's now 2022. So that's a lot of years that will be on our 40th anniversary here pretty soon. So we look forward to working and staying connected to and helping the United Nations to make this world a peaceful place so that we can actually live in the future, that our children can have a place to grow up and they can have their own culture and way of life, but also that the fact that we're all on a short leash with Tonkashila, with our creator, because we haven't treated the earth very well. And the earth is powerful, man. You can't kill the earth. You might kill the man's ability to survive on the earth, but you can't kill the earth. The earth's a living being. And that's the reason why we're seeing the issues of, climate change, global warming, the extremes of the weather, extremes of the four directions, we call it. So this is why we started, how we started, and out of the movement of the people, out of the memories and the history and the culture of our elders, the ceremonies, kept us in our own identity, our language, and our territories. We know where they are. We know where we come from. So that's it. Thank you very much for having this opportunity to share these stories with you and to share a little history of our people, indigenous people from around the world, which there are well over 300 million maybe in the world. So we're not an insignificant minority that the United States likes to portray us to the world. We have a lot of friends and relatives around the world. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. That helped to ground us so much in the foundation and this root of the International Indian Treaty Council and all the years that you've all been working so hard, over close to 50 now as an institution. So I'm wondering if now, Andrea, would you like to kind of say a little bit more on kind of the climate change front, or take questions?
I can finish my part and then we could have questions. I'll clip through this
Perfect.
fairly fast. We talked about the UN Declaration as the minimum standard. So the UN Declaration recognized the international standing of our treaties, but also recognized our rights as peoples, as nations, not as individual minorities or any of those other designations that US and other countries like to call us. But I'm giving this grounding because I want you to understand how we work in the arena of climate change. Recognizing these minimum standard rights in the UN Declaration. Another one is our right to our subsistence, our hunting, fishing, gathering, our planting and growing, our herding, depending on the indigenous peoples. And this is recognized, but it is also threatened by climate change. Article 26 was probably the hardest fought article in the whole declaration because it recognizes the rights to our lands, territories, and resources, which include water, which we have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Not what the governments say is this is your reservation, etc., but the whole continent is what we traditionally used. We have the right to free, prior, and informed consent before development takes place on our land. And this is a real key for us to be able to fight the causes of climate change. Show, of course, a picture of the Standing Rock water protectors. And as Bill mentioned before, consent isn't something that just came about in the UN Declaration, was recognized as a right there, but consent is a treaty right. The Fort Laramie Treaty, Article 16, talks about that no white person or anyone from outside can come onto the recognized treaty territory without the consent of the indigenous peoples. And we had to keep reminding the US and Canada also has this right recognized in their treaties. We also have the right to the environmental protection and productive capacity of our lands, and the right to control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, and that includes seeds, specifically, knowledge of flora and fauna. All of these are elements of our ability to adapt to climate change. And finally, our right to participate in decision-making that would affect our rights, Article 18. This is the one that Canada specifically named why they voted against it at the UN General Assembly. It says we have the right to participate in decision-making that would affect our rights, and we have the right to free, prior, and informed consent before decisions are taken. Now, just to jump to our work at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where International Indian Treaty Council has been involved in these discussions since 1992, since the first Earth Summit, when a convention was conceived to address what, at that point, even 30 years ago, the countries were beginning to see was a growing threat. but we were always on the outside looking in. These are two demonstrations we had at the Conference of the Parties, or the COPs. Everyone hears of COP. Now we're coming up, COP 27 starts in a couple of weeks in Egypt, but that means Conference of the Parties, and the parties to the convention are the states, the countries, not us. But here we're protesting in Cancun in 2010, in Copenhagen, 2009, because we were not allowed into the negotiations happening about the decisions being made that directly affect our rights, even though, and our ways of life, even though scientists at that point were saying that Indigenous peoples were the most endangered. This is a demonstration of Indigenous peoples marching because we were not allowed into the negotiations, and our rights and knowledge was not being respected. The famous COP21 in Paris, where they came up with the Paris Agreement, we were not even allowed in the room to hear the negotiations, let alone have any say so. Here we are demonstrating outside. This is my counterpart on the North America committee that participated in the global what was it called? The Global Coordinating Committee. Chief Bill Erasmus from Dene Nation in Canada is chanting, "We are peoples." And as a result of that resistance that we put up, lobbying the states, doing anything we could from outside the halls of negotiation, we were able in the Paris Agreement to get the rights of Indigenous peoples recognized for the first time in any legally binding environmental convention at the United Nations. It's in the preamble. We want it in the operative, but in the preamble, it means that all the Paris Agreement and all the aspects of it needs to be implemented, taking into account the obligations of states to respect, promote, and consider the rights of Indigenous peoples. The Paris decision also recognized the importance of Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and called for the creation of a new exchange platform. And we quickly said, we're not going to share our traditional knowledge, but we can share some of the understanding that we have about how the human beings need to treat the earth differently. And maybe some of our programs and projects that we have, so they can understand how Indigenous peoples within our own ways have the solution. This was a big moment. Remember, before we were on the outside, looking in. This is the countries and the Indigenous peoples at COP24 in 2018, when we established the facilitative working group for this new local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. And it achieved many of our core demands in this process. We had to have, various consultations with the countries and with our own peoples, our spiritual leaders and knowledge holders and food producers, to see if we even want to do this. And the decision was, well, we have to do this. We have to participate on the highest level we can, because the lives of our grandchildren are at stake. And the lives of the natural world that we have the responsibility to care for is on the line here with climate change. But amazingly enough, this new body called the Facilitative Working Group, we had called for equal and direct participation with Indigenous peoples and states at equal say-so in decisions, and we got that. We also got, for the first time, recognition of the right of Indigenous peoples to choose our own representatives. You've heard at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. They have Indigenous experts. We can nominate them, but the states select them and choose them. Sometimes they choose who we want, sometimes they don't. This is the first time in the whole UN system we got to choose our own representatives to stand on an equal standing with states, the same number. This is us, the first group, and I was honored the North America region selected me to represent North America. We're not independent experts, we're actually representatives, 7 countries, 7 Indigenous peoples to make up this facilitative working group for the platform. different advances that we've had in this process, because now we do have a formal role in these discussions. We were able to get human rights recognized at the last Conference of the Parties, which was in Glasgow. And now we're going to be talking about actually a complaint mechanism there, a grievance mechanism, when Indigenous peoples' rights are violated, even through the so-called solutions to climate change, which in a lot of times appropriate our lands and our resources in the name of conservation. The problem is here, you know, back in 2021, the scientists, the global community of scientists called International Panel on Climate Change, told the world community that if the temperature rises much above 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels, ecosystems will start to collapse. And already, despite the commitments of the states, that level has been reached, and it's 3 times that level in the Arctic. Nothing can restore that Greenland ice field that now has changed the climate of the entire world because it's melting. Even last year at Glasgow at COP26, the countries, in particular China and India, blocked the resolution that all of the other countries wanted to phase out coal, probably the dirtiest fossil fuel that causes greenhouse emissions. But they did put phasing down, but fossil fuel emissions were mentioned for the first time in a result. The Paris Agreement doesn't even mention fossil fuels at all. We also were able to organize 28 Indigenous knowledge holders, including 4 from North America, 4 from each of the 7 regions, to come in and be official participants to speak among themselves with Indigenous peoples about what are our proposed solutions, but also they met separately with the state governments and told them what our knowledge holders know about what's happening. And just a few of the solutions they proposed is returning to the reliance on our own traditional foods and medicines. And when I say the basis of our survival, I know enough to say that if we're not relying on our own traditional foods, our chances are pretty slim here. Trading drought-resistant seeds among farmers. These are Indigenous peoples from Guatemala, Mexico, and Oklahoma, trading seeds. Another example, these are Hopis. They grow all of this corn without any irrigation or running water. It's all rain and snow melt, and their seeds are very drought resistant. They traded with us. This is our little family farm in Tucson, Arizona. You can see the nopal cactuses growing in back. Proves our land. This is the first time we've been able to produce ears of corn on our land, which is dry land farming, because the Hopis have traded with us. The buffalo, bringing back, we just talked a lot about that in Rapid City, the importance of the buffalo replacing the invasive species, which is cattle, to not only survive the different kinds of climate ranges, including, like in this case, a freak snowstorm, a blizzard that hit South Dakota in September, and 100,000 cattle died and not one buffalo died. But also they don't tear up the grasslands. They leave the roots to hold the moisture. This is another example. This is the Tonotum, our neighbors, using traditional methods and using the natural clay in the dirt to save the rainwater. Same like in Hawaii, where they've taken out the invasive species, the eucalyptus that didn't come from there, soak up a lot of water so that they can restore their traditional food, their taro. And of course, strengthening our intergenerational knowledge sharing is really key. This is a picture of Alaska where they're digging the roots that they eat, and the elders are teaching the young ones about how the climate is changing, but how they can also adapt, and affirming our treaty right to free prior informed consent to stop fossil fuel development on our land. These are protests against the Keystone Pipeline. The question here, are they listening? This is us last year at Glasgow, meeting with the former Secretary of State and current climate envoy for President Biden, as well as Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, telling him these things and how the United States has to change their policy. I won't read this for lack of time, but the knowledge holders also talked about loss and damage, which is going to be a big topic coming up here at COP27. And we've been able to, in the human rights arena, establish just at the end of last year a new UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights, because the recognition is now that climate change is a human rights issue, it's an Indigenous rights issue, and they're finally coming to us to talk about what our solutions are. And those that know how to talk to the plants and talk to the seeds and listen to them, which is the Indigenous peoples, are the ones who are going to survive and maybe help the rest of the world to survive as well if they decide to actually listen to us. So thank you very much. Chokwe Otesia. Sorry to have to rush through this, but I know we're short on time.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was wonderful and so important and needed right now. This conversation, as we know, and the special rapporteur, that is a great success as well. Maybe if you don't mind stopping to share your screen share, there we go. And now we
I barely know how to do this stuff, so sorry.
We're all, I appreciate everyone's flexibility, because we all do really want to hear from all of you and your experiences. And so now we are open to conversation and kind of questions and answers for about 20 minutes before we'll have Lisa finish us off with some concrete actions that have been done with school and young people. So I think you can feel free to raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to ask. And I think we're a small enough group. I think we can just go ahead and ask your question. Nancy?
First of all, thank you. That was a great teaching for me. And I think Lisa may address this in part, but as an educator, I would like to know from Bill and from both of you, what would be your priorities for us as educators to bring this, both the Indigenous perspective and the human rights perspective, to American schools? It's just not there. There are schools who teach what they call ecology or ecological science, but they don't have this perspective. Have you suggestions for strategies or priorities for how do we get this word out? It's just so important that we do.
Bill,
Wow.
do you have something? I'll respond after Bill.
Well, I was just going to say that we have a governor, for example, on the political realm, who believes that teaching the true history or teach about the culture of Indigenous people is part of what they call critical race theory, in which they have to review matter of fact, they reviewed a history book and all the educators rejected it. And so the governor had a team of, I guess you call them revisers, historical revisionists. They got together and they wrote this history book. And again, nobody accepted it in terms of people that are, in the classroom. Overwhelming majority said, this is still hiding our history, still not telling the truth. So this is what we're up against. A lot of it is political, because I know educators. I was an educator for 35 years. Most educators like to tell the truth. Matter of fact, it's part of their DNA, it seems like, because that's why they become teachers, is to pass on the truth, not to pass on a revised version or an interpretation that's strictly personal. So this is what we're up against. But on the other hand, we've made a lot of changes through working on the issue of stereotypes and racism. And that seems to be the way that you have to frame it, is that it's discrimination, it's racism, it's historical revisionism. All these things you have to attack from all sides just to get it into the school. And then to be able to sustain it, you have to have teachers that are willing to do the research, that are willing to, listen to Indian people, get some of the education materials that are available, which there are many. And then once, a good student, once he's exposed to the truth or to a way of teaching that allows him to think along with to hear the truth, then they get enthusiastic. And teachers are the same way. They want the educated people to understand their bosses should support them. They don't want to have a fight over what to teach in the classroom. I mean, doesn't have to be, totally crazy, but it has to be fun for everyone, for the teacher, for the student. This is what people are striving for. Though I guess I'm preaching to the crowd, so I'll just leave it there and say that it's very hard, but we got to do it. We can't stop, we can't give up. But the idea of teaching human rights is just another tool in the toolbox of racism in American education. Thank you.
I can just give a short example of IATC's work in California. We've had an office in California since the late 1970s. And one of the pieces of work that we took on there is truth in history. This is all we're talking about this. We have the 2 events on Alcatraz Island still, for more than 40 years, addressing the C word day. We don't even say it anymore. Indigenous Peoples Day, October 12th, and then Indigenous Peoples Thanksgiving. But truth in history, we feel like is important, not just for Indigenous students, but for non-Indigenous students as well. So when the state of California developed a curriculum around the 150th anniversary of the California Gold Rush, the famous 49ers, they brought it into high schools and junior highs in California, and parents came to us, Indian parents, and says, they're not even mentioning that there even were Indigenous peoples in California, let alone the effect on them of the gold rush and on the environment. The mercury contamination continues to this day in the San Francisco Bay Area and Northern California. So we developed our own curriculum. We made a video with Indigenous elders, interviewing them about stories that maybe their grandma had talked about a massacre. We found out about the mercury contamination through this, just a 26-minute film. And we just did a annex 20 years later. We just finished it a couple years ago, and it's available on our website. Just put Gold, Greed, and Genocide. You can see both films, but this one's just 13 minutes long that talks about the struggle for justice and truth in California continues. So we actually had to make our own curriculum. We have a study guide that's being used in some high schools and junior highs. And the first question says, do you know what California Indian tribal nation lives on the land that you are standing on now? Do you know any California Indians? Why do you think that is? If not, those kinds of questions. What do you think genocide means? And so we've had to create our own curriculum. And I know that Lisa's going to talk about that too. But, I think we can, instead of saying critical race theory, we could just call it truth in history. And everybody deserves to have truth in history. Thank you.
Susan, do you have? Oh, you're muted.
There, finally. Thank you. I feel really honored to be in your presence, Bill Means, Andrea. It's a real honor to share this experience with you. And thank you to Christy and Mariana for nominating you. You're so deserving of this award. This is more a comment. This is the fact that you've been taking on the struggle for 40 years. And now I think the whole world feels this sense of urgency. I mean, we cannot wait any longer to implement everything that you've been struggling for 40 years. I wanted to say, so I'm a professor, actually just retired, emeritus professor, but I've been a professor at University of San Francisco in human rights education for many years, and have always brought Indigenous rights into my curriculum. There are a couple of people here, I see my students here, that maybe can talk about what they've done in their classrooms. But I wanted to mention, I've been partnering with different Indigenous communities in Ecuador and Colombia. And a couple MISOC educators from Colombia are coming to the Bay Area November 15th to the 25th. Particularly, I wanted them to be able to go to the sunrise ceremony at Alcatraz on the 24th. And I'm just hoping that I'm going to put a little flyer here to invite all of you who are here that are in the Bay Area that can come. And particularly, I'd love to be able to set up some kind of dialogue with you all in the Treaty Council while they're here, because the MISOC recover. Oh, well, I shouldn't take the time to talk about that. Come to the event, I'll post it here. But I think the idea that you've been working on for so long of now North and South, Condor and the Eagle, and to have that dialogue and to universalize the struggle for Indigenous people is just so important. So thank you so much for everything that you've been doing. And I want to invite everyone, and I'm going to post the flyer in the chat. Thank you.
Just to interject, we also have an office in Guatemala. So our affiliates go all the way from Alaska to Argentina, out to the Pacific Islands, to New Zealand and the Maoris and the Caribbean as well. So we basically have actually members, affiliates, representing 5 regions of Indigenous peoples.
Wow. And we better say 50 years, right?
50.
1974, we won't
50.
72 since wounded.
50.
So thank you, Susan. Mariana. You're muted, Mariana. Sorry.
Unmute. How about now? So I'm thinking about all I've heard this incredible evening, and it's interesting because I have worked with Indigenous peoples mostly all my life since I was 17 years old, and I was part of a guerrilla in Central Brazil because it was during the military dictatorship. And I will tell you, it was difficult. Okay, torture, prison, all that. But anyway, now that I teach human rights education here in the United States and anthropology, I used to teach anthropology and human rights, and we used to organize human rights summits and all of that, and invite like Bob Goldtooth was there, and many other Indigenous peoples were there, and we did all kinds of things. Okay, now that I teach this, my question is, are there any campaigns that we can join? Because, for example, one issue that I face with my human rights education course, which is a general education, it fulfills all kinds of requirements, social justice, global perspectives, and all of that. So it's super well attended by biology, chemistry, and all. One thing that they cannot get is the plural of cultures, peoples, and nations. And so when I have like done everything I could to say, listen, when we say people, It can mean like persons, individuals. When we say peoples, it's the equivalent of nations, and that has international recognition. So I have little quizzes on that, and it requires, for example, Indigenous Peoples rights. Do you have an apostrophe after the S or not? People, students rebel against that, but they say that I'm like crazy. What are you talking about? You got me a wrong answer. I say, yeah, because there's a difference between Indigenous people and Indigenous peoples. When we're talking about peoples in the plural, I mean, I can give you tons of examples where I've argued with many, many different communities, whether there should be an S, shouldn't be an S, you put the apostrophe. Okay, even the New York Times. The New York Times has a problem also with the concept of races. There is only one human race, which is the human race. You can't say races, things like that. So in the United States, there's this S phobia. And I, in my courses, have a hard time. So my question is the following. Do we have, I like to do, because I have to do community service learning for my general education courses, I have to show how we are educating communities. So I want to educate communities about Indigenous peoples' rights with an S. I want to do all this kind of education. It's almost impossible. I have no support from the university. Everybody thinks this is like minimal stuff. So, but I have to do community service learning, which I signed up for.
So your question, just try, because I know we still have Lisa and we want to make sure that we're
Yeah.
going to
Do
have
we have
her.
any campaigns we can support?
Yes, that, okay, perfect. And Lisa, you can
We
jump
have-
in on this one too, before you speak, if you have a campaign.
Campaigns. Do we have campaigns, Andrea?
Oh, we have lots of campaigns.
Oh,
Look on our website and subscribe to Treaty Council News. We have regular bulletins about what's going on with Indigenous peoples in different places. We just had a campaign, a successful campaign in California to eliminate the S word, you know, from
oh,
a whole bunch of public places. You know, the word that dehumanizes Indigenous peoples and sexualizes Indigenous women, and adds to another campaign that we're working on is the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is
Yes.
quite disproportionate, you know, in the United States. There's a campaign right now going on in Guatemala to halt the privatization of Mayan sacred places. Which is being pushed by the government, and there have already been arrests and disappearances of Mayan cultural leaders and the activists supporting them. There are so many campaigns around. We're working on trying to halt renewed gold mining in the Black Hills. That was the cause of the breaking of the treaties, as well as ongoing, continued today, mercury contamination, which is 8 times the permitted level on Pine Ridge Reservation in people's drinking water. There are so many campaigns everywhere where there's an Indigenous people living. There is a campaign for repatriation of their sacred items, or,
okay.
you know, defending their land and water rights, you know, cleaning contaminated water from mining. I can go on and on. I could sit here and talk for 3 hours about campaigns, but maybe a good place to start would be our webpage and subscribe to our electronic newsletter, and you'll receive bulletins about all kinds of struggles pretty much continuously.
Perfect. Thank you.
So now I have a question. Debbie, do you think you can hold your question till after Lisa's presentation? Or
Okay,
is that all right? Would you
that's
mind? And you'll
fine.
be the first one to respond on that. Thank you for your patience. Okay, Lisa, I think we should have your presentation, which I know is going to be rich and really important for all of us to hear.
Bonjour, everybody. I don't know. Can you see me or am I faded out or something? I don't know what happened. It worked earlier. Anyhow, bonjour, everybody. And I want to, say a big chimiguach to the HRE USA for this impact award and recognizing the work of the International Indian Treaty Council. I'm a second generation board member. My mother was part of the founding board, and I grew up going to Treaty Council conferences as a young woman or young person, teenager, and we'd have our youth meetings. And it was really interesting back then. The word sovereignty would come up quite a bit. And so that would be like our peer education model that we would have to all, talk about what is sovereignty, what does it mean to you, and meeting with Indigenous people from youth from all over the US. What is your concept of sovereignty, and to ensure that everybody went home with a good understanding of what sovereignty is. And I go forward on the work of, my mother and, Bill and Andrea, and some of our elders that we've lost, like Eddie Benton Benet and Philip Deere, those knowledge keepers. And I remember them saying, you listen up because one day you're going to be here and sitting in these chairs. And I was like, yeah, right. And, this is, how we move knowledge forward from generation and pass it, like our traditional water lines we have in our medicine societies. I like one of the greatest things I remember about the founding of Treaty Council is hearing how the elders, the grandmothers stepped forward and said, how do we, who do we talk to about these treaty rights? Who do we talk to about our treaties? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to go to the courts? We go to the US courts. That's like the fox going to the fox courts because the fox are stealing all the chickens. So, we need to go to the world. And so that question was posed, and that was where Treaty Council, took statements and decided to create that international presence and begin the work at United Nations. And so, being raised around this, of course, in my own teaching and work career, I've done, try to implement in many ways. We've done projects in the classroom. You're asking about campaigns, about the mascot issue is huge. It's huge, and it's one that our children and youth can relate to because they want to wear the mascot uniforms with those logos. The Blackhawks is always questionable, and we have some team names changing, and it's a great campaign to work around. Andrea spoke of the S word. We had some students in northern Minnesota that challenged some schools and challenged some locales to change the name of lakes and roads. And it's been, same thing with team names and mascots around this region that we've been able to maneuver and really mobilize and be successful in changing team names. So what are the most, because we're kind of short on time, and I know I have a slideshow, so I don't know that if I can share it. Kaylee's going to share it. Thank you. We smudge here. And so one of the campaigns that has come forward is, we smudge in our classrooms, and the schools that have a large number of Indigenous children, American Indian, Indigenous youth, it's kind of taken for granted, the tribal schools, and like in the Twin Cities here, we have a few schools that have a large Native population. And so smudging typically happens there. And smudging is, if you're not sure, it's a purification protocol that we do where we burn some sage, cedar, or sweetgrass, some of our traditional medicines, and we use it to purify ourselves, purify the air, and to bring good energy, and just to help with that SEL aspect for our youth in schools. And, and how is that related to climate change? Well, Andrea spoke really good about it, the basis of our survival and passing that knowledge along, and the knowledge keepers, we're teaching our young people about utilizing their medicines. And so, and again, tying it back to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I asked Christy, I said, what are some quick, because I had them in my smudging policy, but I didn't get a chance to copy them over. But, some of those articles that directly imply an impact smudging in a school district, and how does that relate to climate change? How does it relate to our rights, our inherent rights, that inalienable rights, those traditional rights and responsibilities of knowledge, and us being able to pass it to our children in a learning environment? Next. So we started with, this is just kind of overviewing a presentation that we just did with the National Indian Education Conference, but we started with presenting about smudging in practice at one of our school sites in St. Paul, the American Indian Magnet School. Next. So the teachers at the magnet school and at this Johnson High School, they allow smudging in the classroom. Difference between the two schools, American Indian Magnet School has a very large population and has that magnet status. It was like a global school, but it has a focus on Dakota and Ojibwe cultures there. And we provide language both in Dakota and Ojibwe from pre-K all the way to 12th grade in our school district. And Dakota taught both at Ames School. And so smudging happens a lot in the assembly, in the classroom, in the hallways, in the counselor's office, in the principal's office. So a lot of smudging happens there. At Johnson High School, we have, 20 students in a school of, 1,800 or 1,500 students, and they smudge in their little classroom. They had to share a classroom with another group. They smudge. They have a group called Braided Journeys, and they meet, 30 minutes a day or one classroom period now. And just trying to focus, recenter, using it as an opportunity to track credits, attendance, all of that stuff. So at Johnson High School, they would smudge. And then of course, when you smudge with sage, sometimes people mistake that smell for marijuana. They've been teased about, what are you smoking in there? And then they have teachers and staff that say, oh, it triggers my allergies. Oh, it's gonna start a fire. Oh, it's, A, B, C, D. They have the pushback from the students and the staff. So the students, next. So the students received a communication, their mentor, staff person received a communication saying, nope, no more smudging. We're getting too many complaints and it's becoming an issue. It's a health issue. And the students are like, whoa, this is supposed to be helping us. This is our medicine. This is what we use to help to recenter and to focus and give us, one student said, I even smudge before I go test. So the students rely on this as their SEL, mode of response to their trauma and triggers throughout the day from either home or work. And so they decided they wanted to fight for their right to smudge. Next. So they met with the principal, they met with the student council, and then the student council said, well, after they heard all of their presentation, well, first, actually what they had to do is they had to research. They had to research those things to counter all the pushback, how it purifies the air and strains the ions and all of that. And so they brought all of that research to meet with student council. Student council said, well, yes, we agree with you. So student council called the school leadership, and they had that meeting, and they presented on their research. They presented on their trauma, historical trauma. They presented on their rights and their human rights and their rights for the declaration. I mean, like, we used it all. And so the principal said, well, sure, you can do that, but here's what we got to do. You need to do a school-wide education piece to educate all the students about smudging, just how you educated me. And then we'll do the same with all of the staff. So next. So here's where they're meeting with the principal and, sharing their voices. Next. And so then they start strategizing on how they're going to do it. So what they did for the students is they conducted 3 school-wide, building-wide presentations in the auditorium. They did 3 to cover the entire student body, so 500 per group. And then I went in and did a day long. I did 8 sessions of the importance of smudging, and again, addressing all of the pushback. Next. And here's the students, their presentation. They had a PowerPoint. And I think I have a better picture of those posters. Are amazing. And what they have learned since this has started is that every year they have to do a new presentation and a way to educate their school, their building on smudging. Next. Next. There's the posters. I think these are so beautiful. So the students were able to create that smudging within their classroom, and it's all related, again, passing that knowledge. And we heard at NIEA how there's traditional medicines, climate effects are growing, plant life, like Andrea was talking about, how those cactus were just full and thick, and Bill could speak to the sage and the overgrazing of cattle versus buffalo, and like how we have to adjust for our traditional medicines, what we need to survive. But it's all related. And so here it's a practical application of our medicines. So I shared with the students how I went to, after we got their school building policy, they were talking about, school is going to make them go outside and smudge outside. And I said, well, you know what? I had to do that yesterday with these kids, and that were second graders, K through 2. And they made us go outside, and it was 10 below 0. And the kids, I said, are you sure you want to go outside? We can wait for a couple of weeks, and we'll go out when it's warmer. And they're like, no, we want to go outside. So we went out and smudged. And the Johnson students were like, what? Those little kids had to go and smudge. How come they can't smudge like we can? And I said, because they don't, they're not capable of doing everything that you did. And they said, well, how do we help them? So then, teacher, educator moment, you say, teaching moment, well, this is a policy. This is the district. And we, went through explaining all of that. And the students said, yeah, we want to do that. So next. So we got a policy a smudging policy from Children's Hospital, and the students went through it, and we kind of customized it a little bit. They helped with, revising it to fit a school district. And then next. So we started drafting our policy, and then we took it to, we have to have a parent committee with some of our federal funding for Indian education. But, schools all have parent committees. So we took it to the parents and said, this is what, the students took it, presented it, and the parents were like, yes, we want to support this effort. So then we knew we had the parent support when it was going to hit the board level. The next step was we needed district leadership from superintendent, all the head assistant soups, all the department division leaders, everybody had to be on board. And so the principal or the superintendent called a meeting with the leadership. The head of safety and security, the SEL, legal, they all came together and they all had the same pushback. And so we shared with them the student research as well as the, and we said, well, look at if they can smudge in a hospital in the intensive care, we should be able to smudge safely in a school. And they're like, well, you got that policy? And we're like, yes, it's right here. Here it is. So fast forward, it made it to the school board meeting. And it had to go through 3 steps to do it. We had to have people from the community come in and testify for us at public hearings, but on supposed to be August 23rd. I think I did it wrong. On August 23rd, the smudging policy passed the school board. And so now smudging is allowed at any one of our buildings or events in the district. And we're probably one of the only mainstream school districts that has a district-wide smudging policy. In the legal references and documents, we have, I didn't read that part of the policy after it came out of the printing, but we did introduce it. We utilized the Declaration of Human Rights as well as the rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Declaration, as standards to uphold our right to have smudging in our school district for our children. So the pictures are the drum. We're presenting, that's me presenting on the bottom. And the school board, who has really never ever done this that people can remember, they adjourned the meeting for 20 minutes, came outside and they danced with us and we smudged the so next. So again, with this smudging, now the policy's passed, it's the distribution through the district. We have to do curriculum that every building will be able to implement, as well as professional development for all staff. As this policy, as we begin launching smudging, and the protocol, what happens when a student wants to smudge or a parent wants their child smudged. And we've been requested, we presented at the state and the national Indian education conferences and received requests for individuals or for us to share this policy, but we haven't quite finished the package as far as what next. The professional development of the student. And so what you see here is kind of a basis off of our human rights. This is our home human rights process model, where on the right you see learn stories. And so that's on the right, because if this were a 4-direction wheel, that would be east, the bottom relate would be south, and it would follow the seasons like that. So as Indigenous people, that's part of our ways of knowing and learning. We start in the east with a new day. So it would be learning, and then the students related, talked about it. They learned about it. They had to study. They peer educated each other. They had to think critically. They had to come up with ways to counter the pushback, and then their action plan. They worked on the smudging policy and participated. It was like a 4-year or 3-year process, but that's because we had COVID in the middle. Like we started the year before COVID. So anyway, so that is our student journey, applying and utilizing human rights education and utilizing the model and pushing forward and teaching children how to create change. And so next, I don't know if that's the last one or not.
That's the last one.
So questions for any of us? Thank you, Christy. Sorry it took so long.
No, that was beautiful. That was, oh my gosh, inspirational. Oh, wow. So
Our next, you were asked
what was that?
campaigns. The next campaign In fact, my next presentation in my district, horrors of all horrors, is boys with braids. We had a haircutting incident, so that's our next, my presentation's on Wednesday. But
Well, thank you for all of your action and what you're doing in the classroom with classrooms around. And Debbie, you launch us for our first and maybe last question of the evening.
Okay, well, I'm just kind of coming back. This is great. I mean, congratulations on the award. Like Christy and I were both, you know, at an Amnesty International meeting where the University of Minnesota Human Rights Director spoke. And I can't remember her name, but I have a good excuse. Well, like she was talking about being in Paraguay and helping some of the indigenous people there, you know, with knowing about rights as they're challenging the extraction industry. And of course, and this is what I've kind of noticed, been very aware of for a long time. You can just change the companies, the countries, you know, and there's just such a model of extraction industries, you know, destroying the environment and, you know, just really creating a bad situation. And I just was thinking, and maybe it's not a good idea, but but I'm thinking of how many like words come up that describes, you know, kind of global situations. I mean, or there's an action. I mean, you know, dolphin-free tuna, and kind of, it comes in kind of almost a global thing. There's the word pandemic now that people never thought of the word pandemic, but it can, you know, the pandemic is here and it's here and it's here, this country. I'm just thinking if there was a word to talk, you know, or a way that we could get just that basic knowledge out, and then people could get more educated about the, you know, the individual cultures that are being affected in the individual countries. I mean, there's kind of some stuff, but I just don't think a lot of people, unless they really kind of study, or they just think, oh, it's just so massive. But, you know, sometimes by working with something like the campaigns that Andrea was talking about, but making it a kind of a global thing. And I think that the work that the Treaty Council, the Indian Treaty Council is doing, you know, has got a lot of that under, you know, I'm sorry too. I just had real serious surgery a few days ago, so I can't come up with all the words. So forgive me on that, but I really had a good time.
I think it was a wonderful way to open it. And maybe, I mean, are there any closing comments that you have, Andrea, Bill, or Lisa? And then we'll finish it off with kind of what's next with our Training as Action series, so we can finish on time. Oops, I think you're on mute, Andrea.
And I always speak so well when I'm on mute. I just wanted to say that I want to express the gratitude of the International Indian Treaty Council, especially our very hardworking staff, for the recognition that you're providing through this award. And we're very humbled and proud as well to be recognized in this way. We don't do this work for recognition. In fact, you know, sometimes you get the opposite effect in terms of the reactions you get when you're out there, you know, doing this work. My chief, my traditional chief, Anselmo Valencia, told me once, the more you tell them the truth, the more they're going to hate you. And it was about a real specific situation, but I had to come back to him and say, yeah, that's what happened. But anyway, I think times are different now, and I think this award symbolizes that, you know, you don't hate us, you love us for our work, and we love you for your solidarity. So I want to appreciate that, and thank you for inviting us.
Would you like to say anything, Bill? Oh, you're muted too.
In this thing. All right. I would first, of course, like to thank the panel and the organization for recognizing the work of the Treaty Council. You know, we started, people think of this big organization, which it has become fairly large, but we started out in a little office that was owned by the Methodist Church up in across the street from the United Nations. And we couldn't even get in at first. We had to go through the tourist entrance. And we just kept going. We had good friends like the Palestinian solidarity groups and other American Quakers and other human rights organizations. And so we're able to get through, and we'd go to meetings and there and we could meet in the delegates lounge. So it was a very good experience in learning international diplomacy. And so I think we've been at this a long time, but the idea that what started out as a little organization across from the United Nations, I think we had a staff of about 3, and now become a worldwide movement of human rights workers, human rights advocates, and human rights for Indigenous peoples has become a natural word at the United Nations, a natural phrase, because they don't leave us out anymore, because we can be, you know, discussed and talked about, but we can't be ignored anymore. And that's one of the beauty things of developments that's happened, is that we have the recognition when we walk through the doors as Treaty Council. We have our friends and allies within the bureaucracy, and it's people like yourselves who keep this movement of human rights moving, give it traction. These are the things that we live to teach each other, and we teach each other from a point of experience. And it's not easy working in this field of human rights. There's those that represent, I guess you'd say, greed and various exploitive types of economies. And so that's really hard to deal with, is the monetary side of these acts of change on our behalf for human rights. But we tread along. We do what we can when we can. And again, I thank the organization. I thank Christy, an old human rights warrior from way back. Her and I used to go to a place in North Dakota. All they knew about human rights was that maybe we could show up as human beings when we got there. And so I think we go from that little educational process. You know, most people accepted us very well throughout whatever state or nation we were in. And so a lot of education has taken place on behalf of your organization, our organization, and all the human rights workers and educators in between. So we say in our language, Pilamaya, that means thank you. And I look forward to working with you in the future and putting some action behind the words of human rights. That's when it really works. Oh, thank you.
Lamaya. Thank you so much. And I think Kaylee and Alana, did you want to just give us the next training as action update? And Lisa, did you want to add something before we closed, or are you good? Sorry.
Oh, I should have mentioned the, go back to campaigns. I should have mentioned the Leonard Peltier Walk to Justice that's going on right now. All the information is on the Facebook page, Leonard Peltier Walk to Justice, the route or the poster, the rallies. The next rally will be this weekend at Pittsburgh. So they're getting down there to the last 2 weeks that started here in Minneapolis on September 1st. So we'll be having a rally November 14th, but there's a really good video if you don't know who Leonard Peltier is. He was mentioned a couple times tonight. If you look at that Facebook page, it's open or public, and there's a TikTok done by the name of somebody. His name is Che Jim, and it's very 3-minute, man, to the point information. So I invite you to check out that page and support the walk. And miigwech again for everything everyone is doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's all give a quick hand. And Alana actually interviewed Lisa for, I noted she put the Water Warriors link to a curriculum in the chat that will be an upcoming Training as Action series session. Do you want to say something?
Sure. And I didn't interview Lisa, our high school students did. So we put together a water curriculum through a human rights and Indigenous lens. We tried our best through an Indigenous lens, and we could always be adding and editing as we move into the future. So please do, I put the link up, please do take a look at it. Feel free to ask us any questions. It was an incredible experience, especially involving our high school students to really take the lead and speak with elders around the country about issues of water. And we were so thrilled to have been able to work with Lisa on the project. So please do take a look. And I just want to say just how honored I am to listen to you, Andrea and Bill, and always Lisa, and just how much I thank you. Okay, I'm done.
And Kaylee, do you want to finish or say anything about the Training as Action series?
Of course, yeah. I'll close this out. So again, thank you. I echo all of the thank yous for such an amazing session and spending your time here, sharing with us your experience and your knowledge. Again, just echoing everything that's been said. And we're so grateful that you could be a part of our Training as Action series this year. And just, I put in the chat for any of you who want to look at it, just the flyer for what's coming up next in the Training as Action series. So this Saturday we have a workshopping session that'll be how to facilitate difficult conversations, which ties along well with what we were talking about today. Climate change and Indigenous peoples' rights can be quite controversial depending on the crowd we're discussing it with. And then there's children and youth activism, as well as ending gun violence. So there's a couple more sessions coming up that you can go ahead and check out either on the flyer or on the same Eventbrite page that you signed up for this session. So again, thank you so much for all of you for being here and for being a part of our training series and spending your time with us. We hope we can see more of you as the following sessions come by, but if not, we're grateful for your participation in this session.
Thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Thanks so much.